Our next speaker is the wonderful Bruce Hart, and he was until recently the principal at Aotearoa College, which is a school in Upper Hutt and a high school in Upper Hutt. And welcome, Bruce.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm very good, thank you. Yeah, and it's great to have you here today. You've got lots to share with us about what you've learnt being a principal in that particular school, and I'm really looking forward to hearing the learnings that you've made during that journey. But before we start, Bruce, I'd love to hear the answers to two other questions. The first one of them is, what do you think are the current challenges in the education system? Just a couple.
Yeah, well, I think for New Zealand, it's about ensuring that the qualification systems we're using is relevant and preparing students for their future. And I think that we are struggling as a country to fund education effectively. And I think that's not an easy issue. I think government is trying to do its best. I think the complexity of funding schools well is huge, and I know that education gets a big slice of the vote, but schools do seem to be struggling to make basic programs work for the students, and therefore that stifles the ability to be innovative, because innovation often costs money. So I do think those having a system that's relevant, that's agile and effective of the needs of our teenagers, and allowing schools the resources to be innovative is probably the big challenge.
And that's you've highlighted the point there of that so many people are working with the best intention.
Correct.
Yeah.
I mean, nobody comes to work in New Zealand to do a bad job, and there are some wonderful, and some was almost patronising. Our schools in New Zealand are full of dedicated, hard-working, capable professionals. But my experience is that it seems to be an increasing struggle to make it work with the resources that we have.
Yeah, absolutely. And that relevance that you've also highlighted is something that I'm hearing time and time again from lots of different people. Yeah. And so the second question that I've got for you then is, what do you wish you'd learnt at school?
Yes, that was an interesting. I reflected on that, and I have to say that in the end, I don't feel that my education was that poor. And I don't look back on my education and think, oh, I missed out on that, or I missed out on that. I wish I had. Actually, I thought that the education that I got in the end equipped me reasonably well for the challenges that I had to face. I mean, I went to a single-sex boys' private school, and I don't think it was the flashiest of schools. I'm not going to tell you what it was, but I don't think it was the best of education, actually. My wife went to a state co-ed school, and I actually think she got a better education. So I think if I look back on that time, I think for me, the only thing that probably saved me in some ways was growing up in a church environment where I was in a youth group which had girls and boys, because I think I left that school with negative attitudes about equity, about race, about wealth. And I think the only thing that saved me from having too negative views about gender was the fact of the environment I grew up in, and I had sisters as well. So I think that for me, I became a fan of the co-ed system. And if I had a preference, I probably would have preferred to have grown up in a co-ed school. But the education, the standard education, what I learned, I couldn't say that, I wouldn't fault that in terms of where I ended up in my life.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing that, Bruce. So today we're talking about schools, and you've got a title of your talk today, which is We Do It for the Kids.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you've been in school leadership for a long time. When was the moment that you feel your approach to school leadership changed?
So it was in the period of around about 2010 to 2012, somewhere in there. I had some aha moments, I guess. And so what was going on there was the opportunity to rebuild a school. I think also going on at that time, I had joined, I'd been selected, I had a Will Fisher Scholarship to do an executive leadership training program out of Auckland University. And that challenged a lot of my thinking and notions around leadership. And the great thing about that program was it wasn't education-based, so I was rubbing shoulders with executives in industry and not-for-profit organisations and government bodies and banks and breweries. And so it was a really interesting, diverse mix of people. So I learned a lot about leading people in that sense, and a lot of ideas that challenged my notions around leadership. And I think also the whole journey of my time at Aotearoa had been one of potential change, because the very first thing that I found out after I became principal at Aotearoa College was that it might close, and that the whole of the schooling for intermediate and secondary school age in Upper Hutt was up in the air, and from the then Minister of Education, the notion was that we had to change. And so that unlocked a lot of thinking about school design and school processes and the way schools could be. And so all of those ingredients put together led me to around about 2012 thinking, actually, we need to do this differently.
Fantastic. And that's the sort of thing that I've loved talking to you about over the last few months, is some of those things that you have changed and your approach has changed. So if we're thinking about we do it for the kids, what was the greatest challenge that you faced in improving the learning at Heretaunga College?
So I think in the end, it comes down to understanding the kids. So I've written down my notes, the notion of motivation. And so we were doing, well, people in New Zealand will understand that New Zealand education system was going through a lot of change in terms of how we lifted achievement. Achievement was a big issue, still is. And how do we approach that? And schools were doing all sorts of strategies and techniques to lift that, some of which I just didn't buy into. I thought that they were rubbish in my view. And so trying to lift achievement in an authentic way was actually quite a challenge. And so the notion that I was getting from my teachers was that our kids are lazy. We weren't achieving the results that we were in comparison to other schools. We thought we were trying some of the same initiatives and they just didn't seem to have the same bite. But what I started to do was speak more to the students and actually talk to them a bit more. And I did that in some structured and unstructured ways. And what I started to learn from those conversations was not that notion of lack of motivation and we don't care. We sometimes had the description of our students being so laid back they were horizontal. But actually what I came up with was the notion that our kids were actually bored out of their brains. And so, my teachers didn't have an intention to bore the students, but that's really where they were from. And so they were struggling to be motivated in a system that just bored them. And so that became the challenge then, is to try and then get the teachers to see that they were boring the kids without telling them that they were boring the kids. So that was my challenge.
And that is a challenge, isn't it? Because when we're wanting to affect change, we need to be very careful about how we do that, because it's very easy to get people's backs up, no matter what age of people they are.
Correct.
That's right. So how has your thinking changed over the course of your leadership journey, in terms of that? Because that's part of that as well, isn't it?
Well, I think what I've developed is a greater understanding of what shared vision actually is, and the whole notion of doing, taking people on a journey with you. And I guess with the students, it's also doing it with them rather than to them. So I think from terms of a leadership perspective and leading staff, I've become a firm believer in agency, particularly when you're leading an organisation of professionals. So schools are obviously diverse communities, and you've got your support staff, but you've got your teachers, and your teachers are intelligent, assertive, otherwise they wouldn't be teachers, articulate, sometimes difficult people, and they all have their own views and their own ideas. And so you can't ignore that. And what I've learned is that you just cannot, well, in my view, you cannot lead a school by imposing your will on the school. So that whole notion of what actually a shared vision looks like and how you create a shared vision through the thinking of diverse professionals is something where I think I started to change my approach. And in the end, I decided that agency, giving students, teachers more agency over the professional direction of the school and the decisions we made was the best way to go. And in part that was by design, in part that came about by accident. By accident in that some of my early initiatives around the rebuilding program worked because of the collaboration with the teachers. And by design, when I started to look at curriculum reform, I then had a sense of what worked in leading professionals to change their approach. And so what I started to do was to pose problems rather than solutions. And so in my leadership, I think where I ended up was being the person that raised issues and questions, often through evidence and data. So I could show my teachers through the data that I had that what they were doing wasn't working, but I wouldn't tell them it wasn't working. I say, here's the problem. And then the teachers would actually have the challenge of finding solutions because they could see the problem. And that's when we started to really make some progress.
So what sort of things came out of those discussions with the teachers as you were creating that shared vision, if you like? what did they start to see as some of the solutions to those problems?
Well, that's what became quite amazing. I mean, they started to see that their programs were needing a revamp, were boring and dull. And they could see from, and one of the things I guess in structuring that approach is I did encourage the teachers to talk to students more. So that goes back to that, I guess the title that I gave at the start around placing kids at the center. One of the things that I became much more focused on is getting teachers to place kids at the center of what they did, and making sure that they had students that they were talking to in a structured way around their progress and learning. And then we would have discussions about the discussions they were having students. We would have professional learning sessions where students would, we would ask students to come into those sessions with the teachers, brave students, and we would put them in a panel and ask them questions so that the teachers could see what the students were saying. So what we did is really worked hard at getting the teachers to start to listen to the students and work through from the students. And so what the teachers started to do is come up with their own ideas and their own innovations. So that led to a completely different approach to the curriculum. It led to us be much more focused around our student body, who they were and where they were likely to go. We dropped the notion that I guess was the assumption that all our students would go to university, because the data didn't support that all our students would go to university. We broadened the idea of vocational programs. At the time, the New Zealand curriculum and the government had introduced this idea of vocational pathways. So we bought into that in a big way and structured our whole subject choice around vocational pathways. And our discussions with students would be, and it doesn't matter whether it was a professional pathway or a non-professional pathway, it was still a vocational pathway. And that's where we started to come up with a contextualized curriculum. And the contextualized curriculum basically had students learning a subject through a context. So in English, for example, you would have topics like the language, persuasion, English in sport, English with Māori voices, English makeup and beauty. And all of these would have potentially different pathways. So if you wanted to be a lawyer, you wouldn't choose to do English makeup and beauty. And so what we then had was a situation where teachers were starting to design courses they wanted to teach. So they were able to lock into their passion, and students were starting to choose courses that they could or were more interested in learning. And so English started to become, and this is just one example, more accessible for students for whom English was difficult because they were learning in a context that they found more motivating. Mm. So that's something, and that was happening across the school in different departments and different faculties. Mm. And what ended up, and just to finish that, but what ended up is my teachers working so much harder on this initiative than I could possibly ever have asked them to do, because it was their idea.
Yeah, and that's the power of that shared vision. And you talked about motivation, wasn't it? And really tapping into that motivation, because if the teachers are then starting to see the results, then it feeds more of the fire, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
To do that. So, and what I should have asked you before asking you what the teachers had found with that and how they created that shared vision is to go back to those conversations that you were having with the students, because that's where you started realizing that they were bored.
Yes.
Yeah. So tell us about how those conversations started and what you learnt from those conversations and how you started creating that shared vision with the students.
Well, I'd say there was a mix of structured and unstructured conversations, and sometimes it would just be a matter of stopping to talk to a group of students in the corridor and saying, well, how's school going? And they would say, oh, not very well, and I would dig into that a bit more. And, I'd say, well, how are your subjects going? Well, this subject's really, really boring. I hate it. And out of that started to form the ideas that actually, the kids weren't enjoying life. I had some more structured interviews. I had what I called the Lollipop Interviews. And this was, I particularly did this in the context of some of our Māori learners, where I bring them into my office. But, the notion of talking to your principal is always scary. So the idea was if you give them lollies, they might chill out a little bit more, and started the conversation, in a gentle way. And out of that came some really interesting perspectives from Māori students about how they learn best, and started to challenge that whole idea of what a culturally inclusive school might look like, and how uncomfortable actually the Māori students felt in some of their classes and within the school environment. So we also, had structured within teachers' personal development programs their need to actually talk to students and include student voice and data in their improvement processes that were within the school. And so they would have discussions with myself and my DP. So we would meet with HODs and sit down and discuss what was happening in their departments and their results and where they were going. And part of that discussion would lock into their discussions with their students. So throughout the school, I think we saw a greater energy around listening to what the student actually were telling us. And then we did a revisioning process in 2015, I think it'd be about there, maybe 2016. And that was that notion of having kids at the center of learning and what that really, really meant in a high school context where often education is that sort of production line, mass-produced event. How can you possibly, if you've got a teacher who's teaching 100, 120 kids a day, how is it even feasible for them to place a student at the center of learning? And so we really picked away at that idea.
So tell us, what did the students want? What did the students want when you really unpicked what they wanted in education? What did it look like for the different groups that you were working with?
Well, I think that's the first thing you've put it out. It's different. Each person is actually different in terms of what they're looking for, and depending on the family environment they've come from and the context that they've come into the school from, they may actually not even know what they want. And that's actually one of the difficult things with education is when you start talking and getting community voice and student voice, is often people don't know and they expect the teachers to be the expert. I guess in the end, they wanted learning to be enjoyable. They all had a notion that they wanted to be successful. They wanted an education. And so the idea that the students were lazy didn't seem to match with their aspirations of wanting to get a good education and wanting to do well. They just found it really hard to engage with the way they were being taught. So I guess what the students were looking for is to be able to pursue their dreams, to be able to do what they wanted to do, to be prepared by the school for that. The challenge for the school, of course, is 800 kids have 800 different ideas of what that might look like. But I guess the other thing about a community-based mid-decile school, so I don't know if overseas listeners understand that, but very much a mixed ability, a mixed socioeconomic community, from the very, very wealthy to the very, very underprivileged, socially underprivileged community. How you develop a sense of direction and lift people's aspirations in that environment. So part of what we had to do was meet students where they were, who were they, what did they want, what did they need. But at the same time, a school environment needs to be aspirational, and you need to realize that some of your students have come from families that have never been to university, for example. So is that an option for you? Is that actually something that you as a child could consider doing? So you've decided that you want to go into the tourist industry. Well, do you want to be an airline hostess or do you want to be an events manager? How are you going to prepare for your place in that industry, and where are you going to prepare for that place? So we've structured in a way where those more detailed discussions about the future of a child could take place.
Mm-hmm. And there's lots of times in the various talks that I've done, it's helping people find out what success looks like for them, doesn't it? Yeah. Because you talked about success there as well, and every single person has a different idea of what success looks like. And so many people within the education system, it's like success is passing exams, or success is, yes, going on to university and stuff like that. But that's not true for everybody. And for many people, it's a very narrow way of looking at it, isn't it?
I think it is. And I think in New Zealand, specifically, if you, so one of the things I ended up having the pleasure of doing is a lot of international marketing and travel. And one of the things I realized that's different about New Zealanders is that we're not particularly motivated by money as a whole. Some New Zealanders obviously are, but actually I think New Zealanders are more motivated, and this is a huge generalization, I know, but I think we're more motivated by lifestyle and about happiness and well-being than we are about being rich. Perhaps that's because we live in New Zealand and nobody's going to be rich living in New Zealand, I'm sure, but I think, we do live in a wonderful country with wonderful opportunities, but those opportunities are more about having a good life than having a wealthy life. And I think if I look at the students at Aotearoa, I think most, in a large way, that was where they were. They wanted to be happy. They didn't necessarily want to be wealthy. And so high-paying, highly charged jobs is just not something that was on the radar of many of these kids.
Absolutely. And that creating that shared vision with them helps them to be able to see beyond what they thought was possible.
Yeah.
Wasn't it?
And I guess one of the challenges, I mean, what we did around student behaviour, which we also improved along with their academic aspirations, was we involved the students a lot in the changes that we made. We actually found that harder to do with improving academic outcomes, because although it came, we could see what the students were hoping for or looking for, they were less clear about how that could be achieved. So you did really need to rest on the professionals getting their heads in the game, rather than just, so students could give comment about some of the ideas that we had and how they thought that, and they certainly did, about how they thought that might go. And when we started down this direction of a contextualized curriculum, the feedback we got from kids was really cool. But it was for them to be able to input into suggesting change was much harder.
Because they haven't had that agency. It goes back to that. They haven't had the opportunity to give those ideas. They haven't been listened to in the past. And so what's going to make it different this time?
Well, I think it is that they haven't been listened to in the past, but I also think that they don't have the experience of how things can be different to draw back on. And I think, you asked me at the beginning, how I've changed. I think what I've realized is that in the first part of my career, you base your teaching often on the way you were taught. And I think realizing that the way you were taught in the context and environment in which you grew up is completely different to the context and environment in which you're teaching, and that maybe you need to approach things differently, was actually quite a big moment in my life.
Absolutely. And we've talked a little bit about the Māori students and realizing that they didn't feel engaged in class. There's so what sort of things did you realize then about being able to adapt what was happening in the classrooms to different cultures? Because culture is something that is very much a part of my life, and I'm really interested to hear what you experienced.
Well, I think the first thing I'd comment on about that, if I look back at my time at Aotearoa, I think that would be probably the area of my biggest fail, actually. And I'm still getting to understand that context within New Zealand. I think my view now is that the more I understand about racial diversity in New Zealand and cultural diversity, I feel the more I am inadequate to, or my approach was inadequate. And I feel that there's so much more to learn and understand. And I think it's really, really hard, actually. I think almost possibly impossible for a Pākehā raised in a very Pākehā middle-class environment to really understand some of the context around those cultural issues. So really listening and providing voice for Māoridom within your school community is really important, but by no means did I do that well. And if there was one thing I was going to look at and do differently if I went back into that situation, it would be that aspect. And I think the difference is it's like almost like building the Auckland Harbour Bridge, I guess. You had your bolt-on lanes added on afterwards. And I think we tend to bolt on cultural responsiveness after we've designed the bridge, whereas we haven't really built it into the fabric of the organisation from the very beginning. And I think once an organisation's underway, it's very hard to unpick that and redo that. But I think I saw that done in one school in Wellington better, and I think that I could do that better moving forward, of giving greater space within a school context for the various cultures to come through. And the little symbols and things like uniform and things like the structure of the school, the environment in which they're taught in, spaces within the school, what I call the artifacts of the school. There's so many different ways in which you can do that. And we did some of that, but by no means enough.
And it's really hard, isn't it? There's some schools that do it with sort of in a tokenism manner, but as you identify, culture is absolutely huge, isn't it? It's an entirely different way of being, doing, and knowing, being in the world, doing things in the world, and what you know and what you value, all of those sorts of things. We've been talking quite a lot about students there, Bruce, and one of the things that I've talked with you about was the way that teachers were responding to students, because so much of school has been you have to be in class on time. And you talked about particular students who have come from very, very traumatic backgrounds. And so their brains are totally wired, and danger is on every corner type thing, the more that people understand about that neuroscience. And so they arrive late into class, and there's two different responses that a teacher can give. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. So I guess the background to that was part of that journey around, the notion around placing the child at the centre was realising that for many of our students, we were actually punishing them for a condition they had rather than helping them with the learning condition that they had. And one of those is trauma. But there are others, and there are diagnosed conditions. And often I get so frustrated with the behaviour that kids exhibit who have, various diagnosed traits. It could be autism, it could be ADHD, whatever it might be. And we're looking for ways in which we can normalise these children, but actually we don't look at ways in which we can modify our approach to help these children fit in better to the environment that they're in. And so what I started to do was spend a lot more time with these kids myself, sometimes just to provide my teachers with respite care. But I just found the ability to, as a principal, to completely re-modify the curriculum for these children in response to what they needed actually could make a difference. And so I had one young boy who didn't, for example, do any of the core subjects. So there's Ministry of Education officials listening, they'll probably be horrified. They didn't do English, they didn't do maths, they didn't do science, they didn't do social science, but they focused on subjects that actually they liked and engaged in. And my thought was, well, at least it kept them in the kura, it kept them in the school, it kept them in the process of learning. They were still on a journey, and maybe they didn't learn the fine details of English literature, and maybe they weren't ever going to learn how to differentiate an equation, but they were still learning through their social interactions with other students. And so increasingly I started to look at that work. I was really resistant to kicking kids out of school. And the more I read of some of the authors like Judith Hart from Australia and looked at some of her work and other people that talk around trauma and trauma-related issues, the more I started to realise that we had to, as a school environment, approach this completely differently. So I think one example we talked about happened shortly after I left the school, where a young person rang me up actually and said, can you come? I'm in trouble. So I'd already finished my principalship by then. And it is a student that I'd seen most days for about a year in my office. And so I came. And as it turned out, what had gone wrong with this child is that had a new teacher in this particular subject. And the child had come late to class, and the child had been challenged because as soon as the child sat down, they pulled out their cell phone and started using it. And a discussion took place with the teacher around the fact that, well, there's other kids who are using their cell phones. Why have you picked on me? And so I said to the child, seriously, really? Everybody else was using their cell phones. And she said to me, I do not lie to you, mister. There were at least a third of the class had their cell phones out. So why did she pick on me? And what I knew about, and I decided to read with kids with trauma, is that they're highly sensitive to being judged, and they have a very low tolerance to shame. And so suddenly this discussion meant that this child was now front and centre in the class. Everybody was looking at her, and it just went to custard. And in the end, there was language used, and an iPad was thrown across the classroom, and the child left. And that's when I got called. And there was another incident with the same child a bit later when they went into a class, a te reo class actually, and they were asked to give their pepeha, which again for overseas learners is sort of their ancestry, their roots, where they come from. And to ask a child to do that for a confident child would be fine, but for a child that's not a confident child, once again, it puts them in the front and centre. Suddenly they're on display and everybody's looking at them, and that shame reflex creeps in. Am I doing this right? Are they judging me on what I'm saying? And it was also being used as a punishment because, again, the kid arrived late to class. And so that discussion didn't go well. And I got involved in that because the school wanted to give the child a restorative conference before she went back into class. And the point that I made out to the senior staff at the time was, well, it's really not going to work because the restorative process that you use determines that there's a wrongdoer and a victim. So in this particular case, who do you see as the wrongdoer? I bet you see it as the child, but it's not how the child sees it, and it's not how I see it. They were actually the victim in that situation. And so what I realized through those interactions is that despite my knowledge and understanding of these kids, where I had failed was to establish a system within the school that understood and managed and helped these kids through these moments. Because what should have happened, in my view, with that child is that the classroom teacher should have been briefed on that child when they got allocated the class. So a teacher new to the school, didn't know this child. Teachers had a notion, an idea that, not to back kids into a corner, but there is still that tendency to do that. And so there's a lot for teachers to learn about how to give these children space and how to manage the issues that they present without making it front and center in the class. And so I've learned so much about these children that even in Upper Hutt at the moment, there's a project in gestation around turning Upper Hutt into a trauma-aware community. And I actually got a meeting this afternoon, which will progress a part of that dream and that vision. Because unfortunately, our community has a number of them, and for a number of reasons. And so you have a lot of children now coming into school at age 5 who have trouble regulating their emotions. And as schools, we're not as well equipped to deal with these kids as we'd like to think. So for me as a school leader, communicating with staff around, and that's all staff, not just teaching staff, all staff, around the nature of these students and how to approach a conversation with them and how you're likely to get a good outcome from a conversation with them is part of what I started to do, but it only really just started.
It's such a journey, isn't it? Because it's a totally different way of understanding people and our responsibility within that.
And one of the things around that is that it's again the notion that you can't have the same process and systems for everybody in a school community. So what will work for 90% of your kids won't work with this group of kids. And so what you're doing in terms of modifying and changing and developing school behaviour in a school context could well be working for the most, but for this group, something different needs to be done. And again, schools have to be flexible enough and understand that you can't do one thing that's going to meet all needs. You have to be able to have different approaches.
And that's a really good way of setting up people for life, isn't it? When you're able to treat people differently, because life is full of different people and we need to be able to get on with all of these different people. So it's a great way of learning acceptance.
Yeah, and I think understanding the needs of the child and placing the child at the centre, it goes back to that thing. There's another young boy who at year 9 was probably the angriest year 9 boy I'd ever come across. And we as a school we had enrolled this child from an intermediate, and we didn't know anything about this child. There was no information that had come through with this particular child. And so suddenly we were met with a series of serious incidences that in days gone by would have led to his being excluded from school without a doubt. And it becomes really complex because you're trying to do the best for this child. And one of the things I was determined to do is not exclude this kid until we understood his anger. And, that required having discussions with his family, and his father really didn't understand the anger. In fact, it took a while for his father to actually accept that he was quite angry. And so those were some interesting discussions. But in the journey, he did some damage, So there's another child in the school who actually has a head injury because of this child. And so the complexity for school environments is that notion of how do you keep the environment safe and meet the needs of all the children. So you've got one child who's got a head injury and another child who's perpetrated that event, but they're both children, they're both kids, and you've got a responsibility to both of them. And so it is actually not a simple issue, it's a complex issue. What we were able to do was to get the dad to realise that actually there was an issue and to work with us rather than against us. The child became assessed by educational psychologists, in which they uncovered what we had started to suspect, that he had high-level autism. There are also some other issues. He had potentially been sexually interfered with earlier in his life, which his dad didn't know about, but some of the schools that he'd been to did know about. But none of that information had been passed on, and none of those issues had been dealt with or resolved. But that boy, under traditional approach, would have been kicked out in year 9.
And this comes back to the importance of understanding the emotions, isn't it? And helping students to be able to identify emotions and to be able to learn to regulate those and so on, which is being taught much younger now, which is really, really, really.
And also trying to find an adult within the school environment that they can connect to, that's prepared to give them the time of day. That's quite important.
Well done on that one, Bruce.
That boy would not connect with me. He hated me, but we found someone he would connect with.
Great. Yeah. So being able to identify that. So the last question here is about how do you go about embedding change?
Yeah. So I think the simple answer for me around that is that notion of agency again. I think when you take people on a journey where they're designing the change and they're creating the change themselves, then that change becomes embedded. If the ideas are coming from the office of the principal, and so there was this notion that for many years in New Zealand school change processes that all depended on the principal, and the principal had to have the vision, and the principal needed to be able to impart that vision. I don't subscribe. I think the principal has to be able to create an environment where a vision is created. But if the principal goes into the school with their own agenda and their own vision, I think it will only last as long as that principal's in the school, clearly, when they're gone. And one of the things that surprised me in the last 3 or 4 years at HC, at Aotearoa College, was when I actually said to the staff, look, we can see that what we're doing is not working for our students. We can see that there are issues with it. Look, go out and play, have fun, do things differently. If it doesn't work, it can't be worse than what we're doing. And actually the teachers suddenly decided to do that. And we're quite enjoying doing that. And I didn't sort of realize, it didn't click to me that teachers weren't going to go out and play and experiment and try ideas until you gave them permission to do so. It seemed to me, odd that they would need permission from the school leader to actually do that. Why didn't you're professionals, why didn't you just do that on your own? But I think, especially in those days where appraisal was such a big issue, are we doing a good job? If we fail, will we be, in your office explaining why we failed? The fear of failure was probably higher, and people not really understanding that through failures and mistakes comes learnings and understandings and ability to grow and develop. Not everything we tried at Aotearoa College worked by any means. So the school, under new leadership, is now introducing a new junior curriculum. It's probably been about 3 or 4 years of experimentation with different ideas that has led to that process being now about to be rolled out. A lot longer than we might have envisaged, but having something that's going to work within the constraints of the environment and the resources that you have, is a bit complex. But during that time, teachers were experimenting and playing with different approaches, inquiry approaches, different ways of structuring classes, collaborative approaches, shared classes, different things were happening. And it was quite exciting to see. So to answer the question, how do you embed change? You've got to create, I think, you've got to create an environment where people actually feel free to be innovative and experiment and to try new things, because if your professionals aren't willing to make a change in their classrooms, and if you haven't got an environment where professionals can make a change in their classrooms, nothing's going to change. And so freeing your professionals up to be professional and to make their own judgments and to make their own calls and to do their own thing, I think is part of that embedding process. So agency over what you do, I think, is really important.
And I love that idea of actually allowing them to play.
Yeah.
And because that's quite freeing, isn't it? And as human
Really
beings,
weird,
we need that. We need that lightness. We need that opportunity to be able to explore. And it's that curiosity that so often gets killed for students going through that school system. They've got it as little children, and then they get narrowed and narrowed and narrowed and narrowed, and that creativity gets lost as it becomes less and less relevant. I actually heard a young person the other day describing his life, and he said that he felt that the first 10 years of school were babysitting, and the next 3 years were just, okay, this is what you need to know to get the piece of paper, and coming out of school at the other end of it going, that was an absolute and utter waste of time, the entire 13 years of it. So, I mean, that's a sad indictment, isn't it? So I hope that the students at your school, at Aotearoa College, don't come out of school with that sort of feeling.
Well, yeah, and I wouldn't like to say that I could 100% guarantee that, because there are so many different elements that go into that journey. But what I do know within the Upper Hart community is that the cluster of schools, there's about 21 schools in the whole of the Upper Hart community, there is a shared vision for the schools in Upper Hart, which is unusual and interesting. And that shared vision is around student agency. And so what you do know is that from primary schools through intermediates through secondaries is that notion of what we call is having more agentic learners. And it's when you're looking at things like high stakes examination systems in New Zealand, it's NCA, and preparing students for those, and schools being measured on as whether they're successful or not on the outcomes of those exams. It's a risk, huge risk for schools to restructure the way they're doing it. But actually, the exciting thing about New Zealand is across the country and cities around New Zealand, schools are looking at structuring learning in different ways, and looking at the achievement system as being, and using the flexibility of the New Zealand achievement system so that you can actually create more innovative programs. And so it's not just at Aotearoa College. We borrowed ideas off other schools and we learned off other schools. So there is actually a community of innovation within New Zealand, which is quite exciting to be part of.
And it's fantastic to be able to hear some of those stories from that today. Bruce, I thank you so much for sharing your learning, sharing the journey that you've been on and some of the outcomes that you've seen from doing that journey. And as an encouragement to all schools out there that we can change the system, that we can change the way that we have been doing things in so many different places to get better outcomes for ourselves as teachers and for our young people coming through the system. Yeah,
Okay.
thank you.
Right, you're welcome. Thank you.